All right. Should we get it going, Mateo? What do you think? Very cool. Attendance looks very good. Well, hello everyone. Super cool to be live here. Welcome to what we call the Live versus ImageNet event. This is really Lakera's first webinar of the sort, but I can already feel that it's certainly not the last. I'm one of the founders of Lakera, spent the last 10 years building computer vision applications across industries, and super excited to have all of you here today. I think this webinar is really coming at a time where a lot of happening is in the field of AI. In fact, I was at the University of Oxford the other day speaking with quite a few AI entrepreneurs and academics who I think really work on some of the most exciting applications out there. And what was really interesting for me to see, and what I still think about sort of today, is that even the people that think about AI literally every single day and who were in that room in Oxford on that day are constantly surprised by how fast AI capabilities improve and how quickly it gets better. And I think with sort of the types of AI models that have made it into the public eye over the last months or even weeks, sometimes it feels like the last days, like GPT-3 or Stable Diffusion and the likes, AI is now really capturing sort of the imaginations of people around the world. And I think we will be very quickly surprised again by how this AI will not only power sort of fun conversations on the internet and beautiful avatars and music generation, but soon also power applications across hospitals, on our streets, and in our homes that ultimately, truly improve our lives. And I think it's a really exciting time to be working on these technologies as sort of we translate deep research and breakthroughs that really become products and help people. So to get there, we also have to put an eye on sort of equipping AI developers with the tools and mechanisms to ensure that this sort of powerful AI and these models that we put into the world, they work as expected, that they work reliably, not only on the day when they're put into operation, sort of on day one, but also as the world changes, that they don't discriminate against certain groups of people, and that developers and end users, the people that end up using the cool AI that we are building, can actually trust the technology and that it does the right thing. Ultimately, this is why we started Lakera and what drives us every day. And as the AI stack is being redefined, I fundamentally believe that it's never been a better time to bring AI safety to development teams. And at Lakera, this is ultimately what we're doing. We create that safety layer for AI teams for the most exciting applications out there. When we started about sort of a year and a half ago, we wanted to surround ourselves with the people who work on the most cutting edge AI out there. And that's one of the reasons why I'm super excited today to actually have some of them here with us in the room. And I can speak for myself, I've learned a tremendous amount from them over the last months and years, and couldn't be happier for them to share some of the thinking and learnings with all of you as well. So with that, I will hand it over to Mateo to tell you all about that part.
Thanks a lot, David, and welcome everyone. I absolutely share this excitement in having this amazing set of speakers here today. They have all faced firsthand today's challenges when building large-scale computer vision for the real world, from healthcare all the way to automotive and beyond. And I'm sure we will learn a lot from their experience. And I really look forward to a great discussion on the topic today. I'm Mateo. I'm one of the founders at Lakera, and I have the privilege of moderating the discussion today. And before we get to this interesting part, a few quick words about myself. I did my PhD in machine learning. And when I started back in 2014, which is not really that long ago, the ML world looked very different. I spent my time manually computing gradients and similar activities, which may sound prehistoric today. And the capabilities of models at the time were in a different league. And as I witnessed the rapid increase in capabilities in the following years, I became very interested in understanding what it would actually take to channel that world of possibilities into production systems that perform safely and also work as expected. And after my PhD, I wanted to understand how systems are built at scale. And for that, I joined Google Search. And as an ML researcher, the culture shock was really significant. It was quite amazing for me to see what it actually takes to deploy more traditional software reliably at scale. And it felt at the time like the ML world had a lot of catching up to do in terms of ways of thinking and more fundamentally how we approach building these systems for the real world beyond the more, say, academic ways of evaluating them. I will now let the speakers introduce themselves, who surely have a lot to share on all of these different aspects and have all experienced it differently throughout their journeys. As an important disclaimer, all of them are here on a personal capacity and do not represent in any way the opinion of their current or past employers. And another thing, so while we discuss, feel free to submit questions for the speakers in the Q&A section of the call. We'll get a chance at the end of the discussion to address some of those with the speakers. So that being said, Richard, why don't you kick it off and tell us a few things about yourself?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Mateo, and thanks both David and Mateo for hosting this awesome event and inviting me to be a panelist. As Mateo just said, my name is Richard. I currently work at Wayve, which is a London-based Series B startup focusing on building end-to-end computer vision systems for autonomous driving, and really focusing on level 4, level 5 autonomous driving capabilities through purely end-to-end deep learning and computer vision. In my background, I first met actually David and Mateo through our co-founder Amar, who I initially met at Cambridge while studying my master's for Bayesian deep learning and reinforced learning. And I've since taken those capabilities to focus on developing this technology at Wayve for the last 5 years. Over my time, I started off actually building the models themselves. So actually building and leading our developments on the models that led to our Series A and our first deployments of actual end-to-end CV systems for complete autonomous driving in actual interactive settings in Cambridge. Then from there, moving on to scaling up and building our actual systems for deploying and developing our machine learning, from everything around our model registry and evaluation to now actually working in product and actually thinking about our longer term strategy for how we deploy and develop our machine learning models. Looking forward to this.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Richard. Tom, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, nice to be here. I'm Tom. I'm a machine learning engineer working within the multimodal data team at Genomics England. As the name suggests, Genomics England is a genomics company. It was founded to deliver the 100,000 genome project within the UK, which is basically doing whole genome sequencing of 100,000 individuals. And it now operates the genomic medicine service to sort of deliver the benefits of that genomic healthcare to patients in the UK. The kind of role of my team is to take that sort of genomic information that we have, which is obviously really rich with clinical information, and combine it with other sources of clinical data. So a big one is image data, things like radiology and pathology imaging. And the goal of that is to be able to, in the future, impact on sort of personalized medicine and identify better sort of prognoses for patients with cancer or, drive drug development for those patients. Prior to working at Genomics England, I've led ML teams building a number of different radiology AI systems, which have been deployed into the NHS. So I've spent a lot of my time thinking about how to make these things accurate, reliable, and robust to kind of being deployed into clinical systems, which often look very different from where you build them. So that's the kind of context in which I first met David and Mateo and worked a little bit with Lakera. In terms of my background, before working in ML, probably unlike a lot of the panelists, I don't have like an academic background in ML. So I studied biochemistry and actually kind of came up through the sort of like open source teach yourself ML route. So like maybe slightly different from the other guys on the panel, but something that's just served me well in the past. But yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. Peter, why don't you go next?
Hi, everybody. My name is Peter Shulgin. And for the last a little bit over 2 years, I have been helping Covariant.ai to deploy deploy AI vision systems into the warehouses. Basically, the product itself was the vision system for industrial robots, which will allow them to see, reason, and then act in the warehouses to replace like human labor in warehouse logistics. Prior to that, I spent multiple years in the oil and gas industry, like in energy industry, like geothermal industry. And basically I was in charge of like deployment solutions and everything, which is like closer to the business side of things. So that's why Covariant decided to bring me on board to help deploying this new technology within very skeptical and cynical audience. And that's how I found Mateo and David, because I got interested in the quality control and quality assurance in the non-super conventional software domains. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And Paul, do you want to wrap up the intro round?
Yes, thanks very much for having me here. So I know Mateo from our PhD. So I did a PhD, same as Mateo, but 1 year below. And during the PhD, I worked on various things, including some generative modeling, computer vision stuff. During that time, I did internships at Google doing research. And then after my PhD, I worked at Apple, where I was working on practical computer vision products. And then now I've moved back to Google doing more researchy things. So I think my perspective is maybe walking this boundary between the research and academia side of things, and then how this is transferred over to the product side of things in industry. So just to reiterate Mateo's disclaimer, my opinions don't reflect anything from the employers, as is the same for all the other people here. I think that's most of what I have to say about introducing myself.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Paul. And thanks all of you for the intros. And it's clear that you all have some great diverse perspectives to bring to the discussion today. And I'm really, really excited about that. So just as a quick summary for the audience, we have a few fun questions prepared that we're going to go through with the panel in about, I would say, 40 minutes, let's say, or not even a bit less, 35 minutes. And then we will open the floor for questions as well. So we also have Santiago here in the call, who is the Lakera representative, who will be gathering the questions from you guys and make sure that we get to ask them to the panel. So please feel free to ask questions as they arise, and we'll make sure to triage them on the go. And on that note, let's get started. So maybe to start the discussion at a high level, I would like to ask, what were the main challenges when transitioning from academic ML to building ML for real world applications? What are the cultural challenges that appear and the cultural changes that need to happen? Maybe Richard, can you share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, of course, happy to lead off. I think I'll give 3 answers actually to that to help give my other panelists something to build off of, and we'll go from there. So I think for the actually first time transitioning from academia to industry, the main challenge for me really was the switch in mentality from everything that you learn in ML 101 about, I guess, your training set, your validation set, your test set, and so forth, all those fundamental best practices from academia, just how few actually translate to industry, and how there's really a massive mentality shift to what actually needs to work and how we set up our ML experiments when we're actually working with real world constraints. There's always the famous adage about how 90% of time in industry is spent focusing on data, while 90% of time in academia is spent focusing on the model. But to me, that actually only just scratches the surface of everything that changes. As one example from my experience developing models at Wayve, one thing we really found early on, which is the difficulty of using offline validation sets and losses in a more static setting to translate to the open world setting we're working with in real world machine learning. and how the world's constantly changing, the people you interact with are constantly changing, and you have to be very representative and how you ultimately create your offline metrics and offline validation sets. So a lot of the things was focusing on how do we actually build up these systems around our machine learning to be representative of the task we're actually working with. And that leads really to my second point of how much more time and complexity is actually spent building up the systems around the model and actually on the model itself. So as you can kind of hear from my career path, I found a lot more of the complexity and the interest was actually in building up our MLOps capabilities around how do we think about performance measurement in real world with machine learning models and how that works with really making sure the way we develop this technology is aligned with the product we want to create and the safety measures we want to create for ultimately deploying them in fully autonomous systems, and really making sure it's all aligned with the end product goals. And really focusing on how we can scale up our model registries, our overall operations capabilities for machine learning, and everything, all the systems actually around the model itself to really make sure we deliver these models to quality, to production level standards, and ultimately in ways that we can always be sure we're validating our models to the highest level of performance. And the third one is just kind of a personal point now from current product role. I think just there's so much, it's such a new playing field for how you develop products off of machine learning, and particularly all these new breakthroughs we're seeing in the last year. We currently can really see a lot of new capabilities and amazing superpowers we can enable this technology, but there's still a large gap towards making it useful, making it valuable in everyone's day-to-day lives, and ultimately seeing this go from proof of concept and demos to actually real-life products that we put on roads or in people's houses. And I think that's what I'm excited about with where I'm at today and this technology with really how do you develop these new playbooks for making ML products in people's lives.
So on that note, Richard, I am going to jump a little bit on the last point that you mentioned and maybe go to Tom, because I feel this idea of making something useful is particularly relevant in the clinical setting, right? Where it's quite easy, I guess, to get some prototype that does well on some data set, but then you actually have to fit in the kind of clinical setting that creates clinical value to people. So what are your thoughts on Richard's point and on how that actually applies to the clinical setting?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and would have been one of my key points of, academia kind of rewards these big ticket items, big advances, often lots of GPU spend and all of these sorts of things. And there's probably a lot of product principles that aren't really fitted into the academic literature on ML of well, how do you just decide if something's what is good enough and move on to the next stage of your product and sort of build on from there. And that's definitely something, I've experienced a lot with building clinical ML of you've got to work within a lot of constraints, and you've got to think about, well, okay, this model might be really good, but it might be too slow when I deploy it, or all of these different examples. So I think that product element is probably the biggest switch. And I see it, saw a good blog recently around this concept of a product engineer, who is someone that a product manager relies on a lot to not just do their tickets, but also to take those tickets and translate them and sort of spit back ideas of, okay, well, how does this match up with our criteria for the product and how users interpret that sort of thing. So I think definitely there's more requirement for that within ML engineers and building up those skill sets. And I was maybe going to throw it back to Richard as well, because I'm interested in his transition to product of does he feel like it's easy to get ML engineers to think in that way, or are there certain things that you do to try and promote people to think beyond their loss functions and stuff to get more value out of them?
Yeah, I can give a brief answer, but also want to make time for the other panelists for this one. I think it's absolutely a challenge, something that honestly I personally am still learning and hoping to teach people as I learn along the way. As I said in my initial answer, I think the overall combination of product best practices, of the things we're seeing for how people develop products in the last decade for a very different technical stack, very different capabilities, ultimately how you translate that to a very different technical stack that's only just emerging. No one in the industry really knows how to do that well. And there's always going to be trials and tribulations and failures in actually figuring that out as we all define these new playbooks. So yes, absolutely. There are times where our ML engineers are learning things that they had never experienced before, coming more from academia, coming more from a statistical background, and trying to translate these playbooks from the past decade. But it's also, there are times where we actually need to update these playbooks for what works with this technology and how we need to develop in context of these new algorithms. And yeah, so I think there are times where I'm right, times where I'm wrong, and still figuring that out.
Yeah, and I think it's super interesting that there's such a gap in the way that the engineering component of development happens when you think about bringing things to production. I'm curious also on Peter's perspective, for example, when we not only focus on the engineering side, but also the adoption side. So you have worked with more traditional businesses that are looking to adopt this technology. So how do you see from that perspective the challenges, in building things for production and the challenges in maybe going from the more academic approach of things?
Yeah. So I think that these two universes, like academia and actual engineering, which brings things to production, they exist everywhere. Like in oil and gas, it's the same. There's academia, like huge academia domain, which status, a lot of different like formation properties, etc. And then you actually need to build a product. And I think that I actually from oil and gas, but as well as like in AI, industrial automation, I saw this challenge from bringing people from one domain to another because the motivation of people is very different in both camps, right? Like one camp should think constantly about reliability, productivity, how we will satisfy the customers, and therefore they should be focused on costs. They should be focused why we're doing this, how we're selling this, and to be honest, at the end of the day, it's only about customer satisfaction. Will the customer be ready to pay for it? And this is basically the end goal. And academia is an open question, and this is like you don't want to actually put any limits on academia because it will create some bad effects, and like best discoveries were made without any limits, right? So it's a separate camp which kind of like operates, and then this interface, how to build the connection between those two, it's very challenging. And I like this is still like different companies approach it differently. But from my personal experience, I think that I'm not sure that there should be like even a transition. I think that there should be a group of people which is responsible for like engineering, deploying, growing kind of like the product stuff. And there should be like research division with no limits. So this is my personal, kind of like based on my personal experience, this is the picture I have so far.
So anything anyone wants to add on that question? Otherwise, I will continue.
I think I just wanted to add, but maybe this would anyway roll into what you would ask next. But I think in academia, there's this, like, the way that problems are always framed is that this is really touching also on what Richard already said about this, 90% data versus 90% model. So in academia, you normally have a training set and a test set and a validation set, right? And then the whole competition is, okay, doing crazy algorithmic stuff to try and show that given this training set, you can get maximum performance on the test set. In the real world, there is no training set and test set like that's given to you. You have some kind of product requirements, and you get to decide what the test sets are, and you get to decide within limits and within budget what the training data is. And you also don't just have a single test set. You may have like an evolving test set that grows over time as you identify areas that your model is like weak in or something like this. So like neither of these things are static, and they're always changing, and they adapt and are informed by like the product as it grows and as new requirements come in.
Interesting. And just to finish on that, I think I fully see the point of having no limits on research on the one hand, and the difference with the product work that you just mentioned, Paul. I wonder what you guys think about the actual existence of that persona, the kind of production machine learning engineer, as it is, whether it's something that is already taught and understood, or it's something that really happens at least for me, it feels a bit more like a culture shock, at least personally, going into this, it seems that this mentality is not clearly separated when we train people, right? Like for traditional engineering, you train engineers and you also train academics. and it feels that the boundary is a bit loose. And I wonder how you guys have experienced that, and whether that is true, or whether you feel that the training is already there and people come prepared for these kind of activities that you just mentioned, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if I can quickly go first and answer my thoughts on this. So, I mean, I guess in my experience, like coming from academia and then going to work in large tech companies, no one is ever really trained in isolation to be an engineer. Like what happens is you have, people who don't have very much experience that come in and then they learn the best practices in an organization already. So, you will have people like me who know about machine learning in academia who then become engineers and and bring that knowledge with them. Similarly, you work with people in these places who came from sort of more traditional software engineering backgrounds and then acquired machine learning expertise, so coming from the other side. So I don't know if there's really like I'm not sure if I'm answering your question so precisely, but I think maybe there's a sort of a false dichotomy in the posing of the question, like these things kind of more organically evolve. But I'm curious if anyone else has anything to add on that.
Yeah, if I can quickly build off Paul's answer, I just fully agree with that in my experience. I can't speak to necessarily the what's like in more big tech dynamics, but at least in a small scale startup, it's really you build to the talent that you have on your team. And I think in many cases, the cross-pollination of different engineering backgrounds and practices has really what led to a lot of our key insights and breakthroughs, and ultimately how we deliver this technology, how we define production for machine learning, and really any aspect of what this role or similar skill sets even look like. I think the whole concept of production ML engineering is just unification of a lot of different backgrounds and practices you'll see all across tech, and really, again, creating new playbooks as a result. So I think that that's something that we've really seen work well at Wayve, with this cross-pollination across people coming from more big tech backgrounds, more traditional software engineering backgrounds, more data scientist backgrounds or your ML research backgrounds, and just really having the comparison of those notes and seeing what works across all of those different perspectives and I guess requirements. I think to Peter's point also, I think it's how you actually construct these teams can be very different across different industries, applications, and I guess even size of startup or maturity of startup. I think at Wayve, we've definitely seen the research model separate from the engineering model work well. But I think you also see a lot of different teams where you do more cross-functional initiative. You really try to bring together the data scientist, the designer, the front-end engineer, the ML researcher all in the same team. So that can also work well. It's really just up to what's your strategy for how you want to build your product, and each one has its trade-offs. Really, I think just ultimately, if you can figure out how to communicate across everyone, then you can make it work.
So Paul, you described going from the more academic side and going into building these systems. And I'm curious, having gone through that, if you were to set up a completely new computer vision project that will be released to production today, what are the most important things to pay attention to early on, and what have you learned from that experience?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that I guess like the fundamental important thing to me is like all about having really thorough evaluations and like tracking metrics basically, and seeing how they improve over time. I think when you start something very early, maybe this is not yet like the most important thing, because at the very beginning, the first thing you want to do is to come up with some minimal prototype that works well enough that you could imagine what it might become, right? But then once you get to this point of having a minimum prototype, it then becomes important to kind of encode the expectations of what the product should be in the form of evaluations, so that you have like an objective measure of what you're actually trying to achieve, and then iterating to be able to have some direct measure that you can progress on. Yeah, I think also having like the ability to easily probe your model and like understand where it's failing. Like in like everything that I've worked in, it's always very instructive to look at specific failure cases in your eval sets, because often it might be that you realize that actually the data is wrong, that it's been misannotated somehow, or it might be that you notice a pattern that your model is always failing with, I don't know, certain types of images where like the I don't know if it's like low contrast or something, which you can then use. You can feedback this knowledge into the training loop by augmentation or something like this. So yeah, I think like probably the biggest thing is this like evaluation. Also because, you know, when eventually you create something that will be put into the world and used in practice, it's going to be used in all different ways that you didn't imagine before. And then it's very helpful to have some infrastructure in place to be able to quickly add more evaluation data and be able to track things. Yeah, I guess, so all of that. I think also, maybe I'm just repeating myself on this point, but getting your thing in the hands of real people early on is also very useful, because no matter how much time you spend thinking about how you think it's going to be used, you will be surprised by how it's actually used. And then this will provide like very, very useful feedback to you.
So other people in the panel, do you have similar experiences? Like, for example, in healthcare, Tom, have you found similar kind of activities to be helpful? What is your experience there?
Yeah, definitely. I think my two big points that I thought of when you asked that question probably were covered by Paul there, in terms of like establishing really early on, like what are your success criteria, and avoiding, there's like always a temptation, I think, to just fall into like continual iteration loop. And you can say like, okay, we're going to go implement this paper, and then if we can do that, then we'll just see how much better we can get it. And you can always like, you can keep getting better and better and better, and you get slowly less better over time. So like not falling into that trap, and like, yeah, as Paul said, getting in the hands of people early. Definitely from coming from a like healthcare perspective, sometimes you have to be creative about how you do that, because if you're not confident that it's going to be good, then you need to think of like, okay, well, have I got internal people that I can use and say like, okay, let's set up like testing sessions and these sorts of things, and gather that feedback. And then that probably feeds into the other, I think, massive point is like feedback loops, which Paul said, of like both when you're deployed, but also in your iteration, like what's your feedback loop? Like how are you getting information back, which you can then use to like scale your model's performance more and more. Yeah, I think that's really important. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And I would like to now take a look at what happens from there. So like, let's say you start to build a project, as you mentioned, Tom, there is this challenge of getting it out early and trying to understand its performance before you try to over-optimize in the earlier stages. Maybe Richard, let's look at some scaling now of how you scale a product, an ML product. I think there are multiple dimensions of scaling, of course. There is scaling engineering teams, there is scaling the number of users and deploy to a broader audience. So if we focus first of all on how you go from having an early team, say 1 or 2 engineers that has a prototype, to scaling to larger development teams with multiple engineers, what are some learnings or challenges from doing that?
Yeah, definitely a really good question. And I'm just trying to figure out where to start from my basically massive laundry list learned over the last few years. I think going back to some of the earlier points I made, a lot of it is really just in kind of what Paul and Tom have already been saying, really focusing on robustifying your tools and enabling them for scale. And when I say tools, it also covers our evaluation sets, how you can build some of our feedback loops, and really put as much scalable power in the hands of our model developers as possible. So as one example, a lot of the things we focus on is how we can really build interesting feedback loops from how we learn from our actual deployments on a vehicle, and how we can really make use of these massive volumes of data we're getting out for our fleets and make that digestible, understandable by our users, and enable them to query and filter by any arbitrary hypothesis they might want to test and explore in our data sets, to then build into our next training round and potentially scale up and further automate as we just deliver further and further scalable feedback loops to ultimately just train continuously and automate performance. So a lot of our capabilities are really around how do you build these kind of more scalable feedback loops, but also maintaining robustness, also maintaining a certain bar for performance, and trying to have as much test coverage as possible, and really seeing these tools scale beyond individual users. And at different scales of those feedback loops, you'll see very different levels of maturity of the other systems around them. So a lot of things you have to invest in, for example, are around our test coverage and test capabilities, and being able to do that at larger scales. Actually, just the scale our model registries and be able to support larger and larger models and just like large volumes of them as well. And a lot of our tracing capabilities, just to make sure we have really robust experiment reproducibility, data tracing, and everything else around really being able to basically bisect any experiment that we might want to do, and still be able to understand what led to that change or that performance difference. So like everything you want to do with these tools, they're all like the same playbooks at any scale. So how you might do iteration in your PhD on a Jupyter notebook still looks very similar to how you might do it even at the scales that Wayve's at today. It's just really trying to move all of that complexity as you do scale into the tools themselves and abstract them away from actually the model developer.
Is that something that some of the other panelists have also experienced in similar or different ways?
I just wanted to just jump in and say one thing, which is that when I think about this, is looking back at like the academic experience, I realized how amateurish a lot of the like stuff around engineering and coding is. I mean, yeah, just all of the things you're saying, essentially thinking back to this culture shift and how different things are in the academic environment is quite remarkable. You know, being able to, yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I definitely had the same experience when I started working as an engineer. It was a very, very severe change of mentality on many fronts. So that's a very interesting side of scaling, right? Which Richard described really nicely. Another one is not just the team size, but also scaling from one model to several models to thousands of models, or scaling from one user to multiple users. And I think, Tom, you started to hint in that direction, but like, you know, what is your learning, for example, from trying to deploy to clinics at scale, right? Like, how does one go about, in some sense, getting early feedback and getting to user early, but also roll out that product and ultimately have multiple models that are available for potentially thousands of users?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely like a big ongoing challenge. And maybe to like join it up with the discussion we just had about the like team size and what happens as you like scale, or as you go from like starting a project to deploying and these sorts of things. I think it's also interesting how like the makeup of your team needs to change. And like Richard hinted there at saying like taking some things away from model developers. And so, you know, early on, you might need to write a lot of code and implement like a paper or implement your model. But definitely later on, the more you can shift it to people who are maybe better placed to like understand why an experiment is important and have the tooling to allow them to run it, then maybe the more you can get out of it. But yeah, I guess in terms of more like model centric things around like challenges of scaling, definitely, and certainly clinically, this is very true of like a lot of solutions, because you have like small public data sets. People build a lot of tools on relatively small data sets, and often they're from like single hospitals or single regions. And so I guess I would like break it down into like two requirements of knowing that your model is robust, but then also the challenge of like monitoring that robustness over time as well. So in terms of like robustness, you effectively want to know that, well, the thing you've built is going to behave in the exact same way that it behaves when you validate it on your internal data. And, you know, that is very challenging in a medical setting because different hospitals have different scenarios and different patient demographics and all of these sorts of things. There's obviously lots of things you can do in terms of model development and data set development to increase robustness, which probably won't go into now, but like, I guess it's also important to improve the quality of the validations that you're doing and building up stronger validation data sets and pipelines. And so obviously plug for Lakera here, this is an area where you guys can help in terms of doing that. And I think the critical thing there in terms of robustness validation is moving beyond sort of a single metric and being able to say, define behaviors more in a more granular fashion. because, you know, a single metric can't necessarily identify like what might be safety critical issues within your product. So being able to do that, and it's almost like the unit testing model within software development, which you've mentioned, Mateo, like how can you do that with the ML models and define these like criteria for your model? So that's really, really important. And then I think like the monitoring piece is obviously a whole another industry around that, but it's understanding like how are you going to monitor the models and how is that going to scale like as you grow, because also as you deploy more, your model is going to make more errors, and those errors as you iterate are going to become more and more granular. And so that's a real big challenge to like decide what are you going to work on when you've got a number of different issues that you could pick to sort of iterate your model basically. So I think that, yeah, there's like loads of issues there, but I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists think.
So I'm very interested in kind of the counterpart in some sense to that question. By the way, we have some really fantastic questions from the audience, and we will get to them in a bit. But just as a counterpart to this side, I'm very curious on Peter's perspective from the other side. So the kind of the clinic or the old-fashioned companies or more traditional companies that ultimately are many of them the users of these technologies and the ones that want to buy them or want to innovate with them. What do you think are the biggest challenges in adopting AI at scale across applications and industries, especially as you go to the more traditional setting?
Right. So first, I was thinking about this question, and I think that it's worth mentioning that industries are very different, right? Like if you look at warehouse automation, the deployment rate is probably very different from like self-driving industry or like medicine, because like if you have a warehouse and your AI doesn't work, you need to basically train it within like 3 weeks and deliver it, versus like medicine is a completely different story, right? The training cycle can take like probably like half a year or something. This is one challenge, is like how quickly we can deploy. And I think that a lot of industrial players, they actually look at this very carefully. So they want the speed of deployment plus the guarantee that it will not break. So we need to basically sell to them how we test. And this is a part when we try to sell something which they're not used to, like not conventional software, we need to explain how we test to build the confidence. And I think another challenge which I noticed is that when we talk, so from the conventional software world, we want to have like one software deployed everywhere, ideally, to minimize like support costs and to minimize the development costs, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the challenge with AI, at least like from my experience, is that many deployments and many industries will contradict each other, and the data sets will contradict each other. You know, like for example, speaking about warehouse, in one case, we need to reason about this box and actually like interpret it as a one single box, but in the other deployment, it should be like 500 small boxes, or like, you know, like it should be like completely different. And when we're trying to build a universal brain, and I think that this is the biggest achievement of the companies such as Covariant, it's a universal model which runs in all deployments. The main challenge is like how we actually train it. So like when we have like this like contradicting data sets, like basically poured into the pipeline, like how to optimize this training for the industry. So I guess that's these two things from my experience and from my side.
And what do you think is the solution in terms of, just a quick follow-up, how these all more traditional, like a warehousing company or these large companies, how they should equip themselves for this change? Should they build large internal teams of ML specialists, or do they expect some kind of transparency from the products, or what kind of workflow?
Yeah, they usually, I'm not sure it's ML specialists for sure. I think it's more like established industries. They have like more process-driven like tests and QA kind of like logic and mindset. So I think that like they will be focusing, as I can see, they will be focusing on building their processes in a very conventional way, how they will basically make sure how they pilot things, and what they will try to formulate the criteria, what it means actually this thing works and it can be brought at scale, like, you know, like on their end. So I think it will be more, my prediction, they will not probably focus a lot on the like ML engineering side. My prediction, like in the future, they will be focused more about like validation and testing. I think that this will be like how to actually test what they got.
And so, Peter, you also mentioned pre-trained models and universal models, and I want to segue into something that I find very, very interesting, maybe for you, Paul, which is that currently many computer vision teams start from a pre-trained model, right? It can be such a universal model or just a more standard model. And what do you think are the challenges that lie ahead as these pre-trained models become larger and larger and we transition into the so-called foundation models? What challenges come with that?
Yeah, well, I guess so the first thing to say is that for all the excitement about foundation models, their use as a starting point for further fine-tuning is not something that's new in computer vision. So like in many ways, like any problems that may exist with them are not new and have existed for a long time. Maybe not to the same degree or whatever, but like it's not like this is like a fundamentally new situation. I suppose the first thing is that like if you are taking a model that you didn't train yourself and you don't know what data went into it, then you can't be sure about what properties the model may have. And so if there is some bias in the data that was used to train this starting model, then your model may also inherit some issues because of this. This may be an issue in some cases, it may not be an issue in other cases. I think this is why maybe I'm hitting the same point over and over again, but I think this is why having really rigorous evaluations is so important, because you don't know exactly what your model will do. I guess there's like another kind of related point to this, which is about so one thing that we see is that as these models become more powerful, it becomes like the barriers to actually creating things with them goes down. What I see in myself and like with many people that I know is that people, you learn by making mistakes. And so what I assume will happen is that as the cost of these models goes down, people will start creating things, and then people will need to relearn the same lessons over and over again about, they out of domain shifting, models behaving weirdly in cases where you think it should behave in a certain way, and this kind of thing. So yeah, I think one thing that will be interesting is I mean, this sounds just like a plug for Lakera but I think it's like a great space that you're in. But having ways of like establishing robust evaluation suites that will make it easy for people, for like lay people who are not experts, to be able to actually like understand what's going on.
I think that just to like follow up on that, I think that's a really, really good point of like you, Mateo, I look at the like foundation models and they get bigger and bigger. It's like these like single model backbones now have the potential to, if they contain bias, they have the potential to propagate that so much further in terms of their use, which is concerning. But then also I wonder if it's offset by the fact that if you are multiplying the number of ways you can use them, but also like reducing by like 90% the training time and the training cost of a model, then people can end up being much more like end user focused. And I wonder if that like end user focus on better validations, it's easier to go back and retrain your model, whether that like offsets that ethical risk. It'll be very interesting to see.
So that's very interesting, and I think it's actually a perfect segue for some of the questions from the audience. So whoever in the panel wants to kickstart, please go ahead. So the first one is precisely around this idea, right? You mentioned that you can go more user focused and that you can focus on validation and so on. And so someone in the audience is asking, I'm going to read the question out. Metrics defined in academia may not well suit models in production. How does one come up with a metric for the real world? Is one metric enough? Any thoughts on that?
One metric is absolutely not enough.
Can you elaborate on that?
Richard, did you want to go?
Paul, you go first.
Okay, so yeah, so one metric is definitely not enough. I mean, you need to, like average accuracy across all the classes of your classifier is almost a meaningless number. You know, that can hide so much variation under the hood. I think what's important is that you have like a wide variety of metrics that are very informative. You won't necessarily need to look at them every single time that you are running an analysis of your model, but you want to have them there like under the hood so that if you need to drill down that they're there and you can look at them. I guess like just with the ImageNet classification analogy, you know, you might have like average accuracy across all the classes, but underneath this you'll have like, you know, false positive and true positive rates and whatever for each of the classes individually. Like this, at the minimum, this would be something you would want, right? So that you can understand, okay, am I failing on certain classes? Maybe I am failing on some classes, but this is not a problem because actually these classes aren't really important for the product that we're creating. Maybe these are classes that we really, really do care about, and then this is a real issue. Yeah, I will stop there.
And are there, for example, in healthcare, Tom, are there metrics that are, as you mentioned, behaviors are important, that are really use case specific and that become much more important than any more standard vanilla metric or something like that?
I think it's not the case that there's like just general ones. I think the challenge is to like combine them, and yeah, it's understanding for your product like what is the most important metric. And yeah, I would fully agree of like one metric is not enough, because you want to be able to understand like a plethora of behaviors. The one caveat I would say is like in a regulated environment, you need a top metric. Like you need a thing that when you line all these models up, you have to be able to say this one's better. Because I've been in those meetings where like machine learning engineer thinks that this one is best because of this thing, and then radiologist thinks this one because of this thing. And so like, I think it's very important to define early on, like, okay, well, how are we going to make those decisions? And you can do that by, you know, like, it's like this one's safety critical the most, and then these are like nice to haves, which make our product more usable, like maybe like less false positives kind of thing. Yeah.
Compares quickly to that, I fully agree with everything Paul and Tom said, and that I think you kind of need both as a kind of bad answer to the question. And coming at from the product perspective, I think I agree with everything on the technical side. Really need these kinds of more granular evaluations. So we build your feedback loops properly to really debug your models and have that iteration cycle be as tight and accurate as possible to really make sure your models are living up to expectations of their performance in production, and continuously build that, maintain it, build test coverage around it. But also, you think about it from the product perspective, a lot of what we're saying here can just be translated into like just good like product playbooks. So having that North Star KPI, having your guardrails, having good ways of going from your metrics dashboard into actually analyzing where are you actually serving your users, where are you not quite meeting their requirements. Is this actually the target audience that you're trying to meet, the target use cases, and really getting that granularity from your high-level North Star metrics into ultimately, is your product actually serving the use cases it's meant to serve? And that's where you can really unify these concepts from both the machine learning technical side and from the product side into really how you build these kinds of products overall.
So for the interest of time, I would like to keep asking you questions for a long time. Also, we have some amazing ones. Maybe just one last one for the road, and then David can wrap up the call. Someone asks, how can we monitor the performance of productive computer vision models with privacy regulations in mind? It might not be feasible in privacy terms to just record situation in the real world. Any thoughts on this?
I could have I'm not an expert on this area at all, but I mean, I suppose in principle, there should be ways of like aggregating, you know, some kind of statistics. You don't need to send like all of the data to the central server, right? Like you could imagine it's probably useful if you know, I don't know, whatever, like the number of times that your classifier detected a cat or something, and then to send this kind of like aggregate anonymous statistics back to the server. But this is just I don't know if anybody else has anything more advanced to add to that.
Yeah, I think also like kind of like monitoring on more of a like feature representation level can be helpful as well. so you don't have to. I mean, there's all sorts of concerns about like being able to like rebuild, I guess, like a patient's data from like an embedding representation or something, but that can definitely be like lower risk way of like performing these evaluations rather than having to say like it's this patient with this condition. Yeah.
Great. Well, guys, thank you so much for the discussion. I definitely learned a lot. I'm going to give it to David for a few final words and a wrap up, and then we can take it from there. Thanks, guys. David?
Cool. Thank you so much. This was super enjoyable. I mean, just personally, a couple of things I take away from listening to all of you guys and from the questions is really around sort of the differences between sort of academia and industry, and how we maybe have to work with sort of different metrics, how things actually become in many ways relatively use case specific, but maybe there's also like an opportunity to build more of sort of a horizontal engineering layer that then helps product managers and other people involved in actually bringing products to market. I really enjoyed the conversation around sort of what it means to start and scale projects. Certainly you've seen this in the past as well. You start sort of with your little prototype and things go really well, and suddenly you have more people, more models, and things sort of start to blow up. So I'm sure we could sort of have a yet another dinner conversation just on that. And then obviously sort of emerging foundation models and large language models and all of that. I think we are really just starting to see what that sort of means and how that defines also sort of workflows for ML teams. So it was really exciting to listen to your perspective on that. Thank you so much for all the for attending this webinar, to everyone out there. We had a lot of people joining, a lot of people signing up in the first place. Thank you so much to all the panelists, Richard, Paul, Peter, and Tom. You guys have super busy schedules. Lots happening out there. So super grateful for you to join us and share your thoughts with us. And also thanks to everyone at Lakera, including Mateo and Santiago for being part of this panel, but also everyone behind the scenes who helped us sort of spread the word for the session. We've had literally hundreds of signups, and thanks for everyone who's putting the hard work in and day out to bring safety to AI teams. Mateo already mentioned a lot more questions have been asked. What we will do is we've recorded all of the questions, and we will sort of share some thoughts around them after this event. Last thing I wanted to mention is Lakera is about to launch a brand new community around sort of the topic of AI safety. We will sort of send out more information about this in the next couple of days. I'm super excited about that. And I think if there's an audience sort of to join this this community, then it's definitely this one. So we will keep you posted, and we are excited and look forward to seeing you at future webinars again. So thank you so much, guys, and this was fun.